Hi friends, today we are going to have another crazy adventure Arctic expedition led by Vilhjalmur Stefansson. We're already familiar with this character from Ada Blackjack's survival video, so if you haven't seen it yet, be sure to check it out. And today we're going to be transported to a thrilling prequel and Arctic voyage on the brigantine Karluk. A polar explorer with a hard-to-pronounce name, Vilhjalmur Stefansson once moved with his family from northern Iceland, and you could say the Arctic is literally in his blood. But life for settlers in Canada in those days was full of hardships, poverty, scarce food, and even hunger led to disease and high mortality rates. The loss of 2 children forced Stefansson's father, Johan, to move the family to Dakota, USA. Stefansson grew up a sickly child, and perhaps this is what influenced his fate. His parents saw that he was weak and decided not to burden him with hard work on the farm and sent him to study. It was not an easy decision, because the family needed laborers. But instead of doing field work, the boy learned to read and write, skills that were rare among farmers and villagers back then. His passion became books about travel and heroes, Icelandic sagas, stories about Vikings, adventures of Robin Hood and Robinson Crusoe. This literature prepared him for future travel and exploration. Stefansson himself wrote, "I wanted to find myself lost and forgotten in the middle of the ocean, or visit Robinson on his island." Before I continue, I would like to ask you to please don't forget to give this video a like. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Subscribe, I know a lot of people watch us without subscribing. Click on the bell button, it's not hard, and I'll enjoy it. Now, let's get on with it. But the quiet days with books didn't last long. When Stefansson was 13 years old, his father died, and he and his brother were left with the full responsibility for the family. Vilhjalmur faced hard physical labor, and this only strengthened his intention to get an education and earn in a different way. After a few years, he managed to enroll at the University of North Dakota, where he immediately proved himself as a brilliant student and speaker. Stefansson was not afraid to express his opinion, even if it differed from the generally accepted, which also says a lot about his personality. He was a charismatic person, able to persuade, but this quality did not always turn out in his favor. While studying at Dakota, he was noticed by Professors Phenom and Dr. Alita, who offered him admission to Harvard and even paid his tuition at the theological faculty. This is how Vilhjalmur ended up at Harvard, where the head of the anthropology department was interested in him, and Stefansson transferred there. While still a student, he began his scientific career, and in 1905 organized an anthropological expedition to Iceland, his homeland. Studying an ancient cemetery, he concluded that the diet of ancient Icelanders consisted of meat, fish, and milk, which was confirmed by the teeth found without traces of caries. This study was the beginning of his scientific endeavors and reinforced his belief in the special relationship between diet and the Arctic, which later influenced his expeditions. He was soon invited by the American explorer Ernst de Coven to participate in an Anglo-American expedition to explore the Beaufort Sea and search for a hypothetical land in the north. Although it was already the 20th century, knowledge of the Arctic remained limited. Stefansson obtained a position as an anthropologist and traveled north. This expedition started in British Columbia, skirted Alaska, and headed along the northern coast of Canada, where Stefansson was to meet it at Herschel Island. However, the ship was delayed and he found himself forced to linger in the Arctic. It was his first winter in the north, and he decided to stay with the Eskimos to get to know them better. According to him, it is impossible to truly understand people of another race unless you live with them, and for the time this approach was groundbreaking. The explorers did not hurry to get to know the life of the Eskimos, preferring to observe them from afar. Moreover, few people would dare to live among the Eskimos, eat their food, and follow their customs. However, Vilhjalmur Stefansson stayed to live with the Eskimos as equals, participating in their life. He goes fishing with the Kupagmi-Utah tribe, which translates to Big River, to study their life, language, and culture in the field. Later they moved to the opposite side of the Mackenzie River Delta. The Eskimos in this area have been almost untouched by civilization and have never seen white people. Stefansson makes daily entries in his diary. Caught fish is the main food. I have read in books that the Eskimos eat it raw, but in practice I have seldom seen this confirmed. Usually fresh fish is served frozen. The people of the north accept Stefansson as a member of their society, treating him as an equal, and this allows him to conclude that empathy among these people is more developed than in Western civilizations. In the conditions of the north, it is possible to survive only together, and this is what he writes: the Eskimo never refuses food to anyone in need, always ready to share fish, believing that everyone has an equal right to it. When spring arrives, Stefansson returns to Herschel Island in hopes of joining a polar expedition, but discovers that the ship that was supposed to pick him up has been destroyed by ice. His hopes of visiting Victoria Island and meeting tribes unknown to science melt away like smoke. The scientist is forced to return to New York, and this, in my opinion, is one of the key moments of his biography. He returns with unique ethnographic data and incredible stories about life among the Eskimos, which instantly brings him recognition in scientific circles and popularity among the general public. Stefansson himself was obviously fascinated by the people he met, as well as the Arctic expanse, which he returned to again and again. It was on this trip that he formulated the concept of a friendly Arctic. Stefansson, like a great orator, began to convince that the Europeans' failures in the Arctic were due to their hostile attitude towards the place, seeing it as a barren wasteland in which it was impossible to survive without all the trappings of civilization. In fact, he believed that the Arctic was a friendly land with an abundance of fish and game where man, merging with nature, could live comfortably. He also emphasized that the Inuit rarely travel in groups of more than 10 people, while Western explorers travel in huge teams, causing starvation and death. This concept raised serious objections, for example, from Amundsen, but also found many supporters. In the future, it was such views that led to tragic consequences in an expedition involving Ada Blackjack. Stefansson combined the qualities of an outstanding polar explorer and scientist as well as a brilliant orator. He skillfully persuaded the public of his views on the Arctic, while at the same time developing a plan for a new expedition to Victoria Island. Seeking support, he turned to the American Museum of Natural History. The director of the museum recalled of him, "I was impressed by the personal qualities and restrained enthusiasm of this young man. I was attracted not so much by the project as by Stefansson's personality. Maybe he will become a new Nansen, Peary, or Shackleton." The expedition aims to meet unfamiliar tribes of Eskimos who have not yet seen whalers and missionaries. Stefansson's charisma has attracted funding from the Canadian government and the Hudson Bay Company. Based on his successful experience wintering with the Eskimos, Stefansson decided to take a minimum of equipment: 2 cameras, 3 rifles, ski poles, tobacco, pencils, and paper for notes. The expedition was intended to last 1 year, but it lasted a full 5 years. By this time, Stefansson was fluent in several Eskimo dialects, allowing him to record their folklore and songs himself. Previously, the explorers had worked through interpreters, which made recording very difficult. The expedition spent the first wintering at Cape Barrow, and in the fall of 1909 returned to Cape Peary, from where it planned to go to Victoria Island, the main goal of the expedition. However, the way to the island through the ice was dangerous. The expedition has to winter again, even though it should have ended by now, but Stefansson remains in the Arctic, which says a lot about his character. He describes his wintering in my life with the Eskimos. A highly entertaining read. It is not until April 1910 that the group heads east and soon finds a settlement with several igloos. The inhabitants Stefansson would later call the Copper Eskimos. And from them he again learns of a people with blue eyes and red hair living further north. On Victoria Island there is a long-awaited encounter with the blonde-haired Eskimos. Stefansson writes, "When I saw them I realized I was on the verge of a major scientific discovery," his companion, Eskimo Natkusik, was equally amazed. "They are not Eskimos, they only wear clothes and speak like Eskimos, but they are other people." Stefansson has been studying the unusual people for months, collecting their folklore and everyday objects. Stefansson returns to America a hero. In 5 years, instead of the planned 1 year, he made many discoveries. In those days, it was as risky as going into space without a spacesuit and coming back. The Arctic turned out to favor him as he learned from the Eskimos and felt like their guest. He described his second expedition in detail in the book My Life with the Eskimos. At that time, everything related to the Arctic and polar exploration was popular, and Stefansson gained fame. He lectured, corrected famous scientists, and enjoyed the authority and love of the people. He became a star, though not as famous as Amundsen, but still bright. Stefansson easily convinced the Canadian government and sponsors of his concept of a friendly Arctic. In the spring of 1913, 3 ships, the Alaska, the Mary Sachs, and the flagship Karluk, set sail north. The expedition is divided into 2 detachments. The southern detachment explores the Mackenzie River Basin and Coronation Bay, while Stefansson's detachment moves north to search for undiscovered land. Many scientists of the time believed that, judging from currents and ice movements, there might be land in the area, and Stefansson rushes to claim it. The expedition is accompanied by the legendary Captain Bob Bartlett, captain of Peary's ship when sailing to the North Pole. Stefansson decided to follow his concept of a friendly Arctic, setting off with minimal food and gear. His idea was to set up drifting stations on ice floes that would ensure survival through local resources. He was convinced that a man who knew how to hunt seals could survive in the harsh conditions. The flagship of the expedition, the Karluk, was not new. It was designed for fishing, then converted into a whaling vessel, and only years later it became the flagship of the Stefansson expedition. In early August 1913, Captain Bartlett led Karluk through the icy waters off the coast of Alaska to the rendezvous point on Herschel Island. There he was to rendezvous with other vessels. Bartlett anchors a mile offshore at Cape Smith and waits for Stefansson, who has gone ashore for sled dogs, supplies and skins for winter clothing. Stefansson soon returns with the Inuit hired to accompany him, the head of the family, Kuraluk, a renowned hunter, his wife Ruk, later nicknamed Auntie, and 2 daughters. The 19-year-old Inuit Kotaktovik, an experienced hunter and igloo builder, also appears. He and Kuraluk immediately go hunting to provide the expedition with the fresh meat needed to prevent scurvy. The team on Stefansson's expedition worked closely with the Inuit, for they possess skills without which it would be impossible to survive in the Arctic. Auntie, for example, taught the expedition to line their shoes with grass or moss to absorb moisture and protect them from frostbite. Kurak and Ko Taktovik immediately began hunting seals, as the expedition needed fresh meat to prevent scurvy. Every time the Karluk got stuck, the 2 Inuit hunters would disembark and head for the open water, where they would wait for hours for a seal to surface so they could shoot it. Most of the crew found the seal tasty, despite its dark color and strong fishy smell. The ship's cook even devised special dishes, serving them as a delicacy: seal steak and kidney pie once a week. As the ship headed north, Stefansson instructed Captain Bartlett to stay close to the Alaskan and Yukon coasts so that the expedition could disembark and continue by sled if necessary. Bartlett, however, decided to stick to open water, hoping for passage to the east. After sailing from Point Barrow for less than 10 days, the Karluk became stuck in ice 20 miles from shore. 10 scientists, 13 crew members and Inuit remained aboard. Winter had set in and provisions were scarce, requiring regular hunting for food. Stefansson set out on a hunting raid to replenish supplies, taking with him anthropologist Jennis, meteorologist McConnell, photographer Wilkins, and 2 Inuit. They expected to return in 10 days, but the weather intervened. A storm blew up, and Stefansson saw the Karluk freeze into the ice and drift eastward. A wide rip in the raging sea prevented them from reaching the ship, and they moved westward, hoping that the vessel would lash up against the shore. During the crossing, they spotted 2 other ships of the expedition, signaled distress, and were rescued. Stefansson believed that if the Karluk sank, the crew would be able to cross the ice and reach the mainland. However, instead of rescuing the crew, he decides to continue the expedition, abandoning the Karluk. In the spring of 1914, Stefansson and Anderson set out for Banks Land, traveling 700 miles in 96 days. Their voyage lasted 5 years, and the expedition discovered 3 islands north of Canada. As for the crew of the Karluk, they remained on the ice floe, waiting for winter. Under the leadership of Captain Bartlett, the crew built igloos and transferred supplies from ship to ice, preparing for the eventual sinking of the ship. In the face of starvation, Inuit skills proved invaluable. Hunters Kurak and Ko Taktovik stayed aboard, and with them his wife, Auntie Kiru, and daughters Helen and Mook. In search of sustenance, 8-year-old Helen invented a way to catch seagulls with a feather tied to a piece of fat, which saved the crew from starvation. At this time, Kiru was catching cod with primitive fishing rods. However, realizing that winter would become unbearable, Kayak decided to build a kayak to hunt walruses and seals. Although the danger was great, the old hunter set to work, impressing Europeans with his skill. Kayak found some suitable planks, and with only a knife and axe, he began cutting them to create the frame of the kayak. Amazingly, he used the axe blade as a chisel to work the side rungs and ribs of the planks. The construction of the kayak was slow and painstaking. He reinforced each part of the frame with sealskin straps. To make a paddle with 2 blades, Kayak took a light plank that had been washed ashore by ice. 2 weeks after he began work, he brought the frame to his family's igloo to let it dry well. When the frame was ready, his wife took measurements, cut out pieces of sealskin and stretched them tightly over the frame, so the boat was complete. Kayak's work amazed the researchers. One of them wrote in his diary when the kayak was finished, "It looked as if it had been made by an experienced boat builder using modern tools, not by an Inuit with a knife and axe." When the frame of the kayak was complete, the hunter's wife took measurements, cut the sealskin and stretched it tightly over the frame. Soon the boat was ready. When the walruses roared on the ice floe, the hunter dropped the boat on the water and boldly headed between the ice floes. It was a risky maneuver. His heart was racing and his hands were sweating, but the wind was fair and the ice floe with 5 huge walruses could be seen ahead. If he could get closer without spooking them, he might have a chance at prey. However, the walruses spotted the kayak and immediately disappeared into the water, leaving the hunter with nothing. On January 10, 1914, the ice destroyed the hull of the Kayak and the ship sank to the bottom, leaving the crew on an ice floe in the middle of the white stillness. Captain Bartlett was the last to leave the ship, planting the ship's flag and playing Chopin's funeral march on the gramophone, which played until the sinking. He had, however, moved all supplies and equipment to the ice floe beforehand and began to prepare for evacuation by constructing a sled. Bartlett, an experienced sailor, was aware of the danger and left food stores in case of disaster. The closest one was on Wrangel Island, 130 kilometers away. The captain sent 6 men to explore the path to Herald Island. 2 returned reporting that there was no passage, and 4 decided to go on, but they were never seen again. In March, when the ice stabilized, Bartlett took 20 days to lead the team to the island and a food store where a camp was set up. Then, leaving the survivors behind, the captain and a young Inuit man made the 200-kilometer trek across Siberia, where they found help from locals and were able to return to Alaska. In September, the icebreaker King Wing attempted to rescue the survivors on the island, but it was not successful until the following year. When the crew returned to Canada, they blamed Stefansson for everything. 5 years later, Stefansson himself returned from the Arctic and met with public delight with the discoveries of 3 new islands. He later published a book, The Friendly Arctic, blaming Bartlett for the Kayak incident, but this theory was met with criticism, especially by polar explorer Roald Amundsen. Ironically, one of the crew, Fred Moore, went on another expedition with Stefansson 3 years later and died on Wrangel Island. This story is a reminder of difficult decisions in extreme conditions where it is difficult to separate right from wrong. Stefansson, despite significant accomplishments, faced the consequences of his views. His friendly Arctic theory may have worked for him, but proved fatal for others. If you enjoyed this story, please put a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is important to me, and your comments I read everything. Until new meetings on next summit.